This is the Literary Atlanta podcast. I'm Allison Law. Spring brings with it a flurry of awards activity in the publishing world, both globally and locally. The 2018 Pulitzer Prize Award winners were announced on April 18th. In addition to the big news that Kendrick Lamar was the first non-jazz or classical artist to ever win a Pulitzer for his CD Damn, awards in fiction went to Andrew Sean Greer for his novel Less. The History Award went to Jack E. Davis for his book Gulf, The Making of an American Sea, which, by the way, I bought a copy while spending a few days on the Gulf Coast, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Other winners were Caroline Fraser for her biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder, author of the Little House on the Prairie series, Half-Light, the collected poems of Frank Bidart from 1965 to 2016, won the Pulitzer for poetry, and Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Forman Jr. won the Pulitzer for general nonfiction. Southern independent booksellers have selected 30 finalists for the 2018 Southern Book Prize. These books represent the best in Southern literature across 8 different categories. The winners will be announced in July. And even closer to home, the Townsend Prize for Fiction was awarded to Julia Franks for her novel Over the Plain Houses. I want to take a moment to thank Anna Schachner, editor of the Chattahoochee Review and chairwoman of the Townsend Committee, for inviting me to attend the Townsend ceremony on April 19th. I was able to grab quick interviews with 6 of the finalists on that night, so listen for that on a future episode of Literary Atlanta. Does it really make a difference for a book to be named an award winner? In 2012, Publishers Weekly analyzed the book sales of Pulitzer winners from 2007 to 2011, and they concluded that on average, following the Pulitzer announcement, weekly sales tripled what they were before the prize. Millions of books are published each year, so that first few weeks around the on-sale date, they're usually when you will hear about the book, hear the author interviewed, or see the book review. Awards breathe new life into titles that have been gathering literal and figurative dust for some months. And I just took a quick peek at Amazon. I searched for Jackie Davis's book, The Gulf, and the book page has been updated to reflect the awards and nominations that the book's recently garnered. But if you scroll down to the frequently bought together section, you'll see that Amazon's showing that its current customers have recently been buying the book together with other Pulitzer nominees, Prairie Fires, and Less. I'm not sure how the regional and state awards affect sales, but the Southern Book Prize captures the sentiments of bookstore workers who are doing the admirable work of hand-selling books they love in their brick-and-mortar establishments. And the Townsends recognize books with Georgia ties and literary merits that have been published every 2 years. So again, awards breathe new life into titles. And I think that's a very good thing if you're like me and have a short attention span and an unruly TBR pile. And always, always consider the source. Whether you're reading an online review on Amazon or Goodreads, whether you're responding to a Bookstagram photo, or you're looking at a Pulitzer or Southern Book Prize or Townsend finalist list. Look at the names of the committee members. Look at the people who are recommending books on those little index cards in your local bookstore, those shelf talkers that have a little explanation why the bookseller thinks that you should buy and read that book. Find some trusted resources and go with that. But awards lists are always fun to review and see how your taste stacks up with the taste of the people for these various awards. Milestones and anniversaries can also remind us to read books with relevant subject matter. The recent 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. provided an opportunity for me to reread and revisit one of my favorite memoirs, written by an author who grew up in Atlanta during the Civil Rights Movement and who attended Dr. King's funeral with her father. My conversation with Jessica Handler about her books Invisible Sisters and Braving the Fire is coming up next. This is episode 37 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. Jessica Handler is the author of Braving the Fire, a guide to writing about grief and loss, and Invisible Sisters, a memoir that was named one of the 25 books all Georgians should read, and Atlanta Magazine's best memoir of 2009. Jessica's essays and nonfiction have appeared in Tin House, Drunken Boat, Full Grown People, Brevity, Newsweek, The Washington Post, and More Magazine. In the last year, she was a guest on the New York Times Dear Sugars podcast, hosted by Cheryl Strayed and Steve Almond. Jessica is a marvelous teacher. She earned an MFA in creative writing from Queen's University in Charlotte and has traveled the globe to teach workshops and classes. She's a visiting lecturer in the English department at Atlanta's Oglethorpe University. She invited me to visit one of her classes at Oglethorpe the day before we recorded this interview, and it was so fun to see her in her element. She serves on the advisory board for the Decatur Writers Studio with me. She's also my friend and a former client. But I didn't get to know Jessica Handler, the person, until after I'd read Invisible Sisters and was completely enamored with Jessica Handler, the writer. I was blown away by her book back then and was so glad to get an opportunity to reread it and interview Jessica about her writing this past month as part of the Beyond Books author series at the Wren's Nest. The following is a recording of that interview, which took place in front of a live audience at the Wren's Nest on Wednesday, April 4th. That date was significant because it was the day we recognized that 50 years had passed since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Jessica and I began our conversation talking about that anniversary. I guess we should talk. It's now 7:19.
Yeah.
And you were saying as we were walking in that I think 7:01.
7:01. Yeah.
Is when the shooting happened 50
So
years ago.
6:01 Central Time. 6:01 Central Time. So,
yeah.
But here that would be 7:01. So it's 7:01 this evening here. That's the exact 50th anniversary of the murder. So I don't know if anniversary is the best word, but
I know it's a strange thing to commemorate. You don't want to say celebrate.
No. But there's a very grave moment, and I was thinking about that on the way over here because the 50th demarcation means there's been a 40th, a 30th, a 20th, but there's something really remarkable about half a century, and half a century to the minute. And I know that one of the things we want to talk about tonight is what has that half a century led to, and how do we further what we've learned or what we think we should be doing, with that half century of knowledge.
Right.
So, but yeah, we had a moment of silence at 7:01, just sort of here, kind of walked around the room and made everybody stop talking.
Yeah. It's an interesting day, and it's a day that you write about beautifully in your memoir. This is a memoir that came out in 2009. Mm-hmm. It's a memoir that I wrote before I ever knew Jessica Handler. I knew Jessica Handler, in the book. Right. Yeah. So it was interesting for me to reread it now that we've been friends for 7 years.
For 7 years, yeah. I remember having coffee with you or lunch with you and talking about this. It was 7 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Man.
Yeah, that was a while ago. But it's... we can talk about, where you're from and how long you've been in Atlanta and what brought your family to Atlanta, mm-hmm. since not many of us who live here are actually from Atlanta. But you are not a native, but you've pretty much been assimilated.
Yeah, I'm not a native because I wasn't born here, so I can't call myself a Grady baby or anything like that. But we moved here in 1965, and I can read that section if you'd like.
Sure.
That explains it. So I'm going to jump around a little bit in Invisible Sisters. So we'll do that, and this will explain it in more carefully crafted words than I might have off the top of my head at the moment. We moved to Atlanta in 1965 because my father believed he had a chance to change the world. He was the son of a lawyer who had become known among champions of social justice, a man who had argued and won a case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1953. In that case, Garner v. Teamsters Union, the court upheld the rights of union members to picket for fair wages. A framed photograph of my victorious, smiling grandfather posing with his legal team on the mammoth steps of Chief Justice Earl Warren's court was displayed in my grandparents' house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. A reverent hush signaled my grandfather's arrival into almost any room. His presence alone seemed to indicate that it was possible to fight injustice and win. After 2 years in Detroit, my father took a job with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the labor union that had become widely recognized in the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Manhattan in 1911. The union was a client of my grandfather's. My great-aunt Mary worked as a secretary in the union's New York office. Even before I started first grade, I knew to follow the instructions in the union's song and look for the union label. I probably don't have to pay to clear that.
I sang that in my head the whole song when I read it.
Yeah? Oh, yeah. Well, there's more, as you know. So in the early 1960s, cotton grew outside towns in Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, and Mississippi. The mills and factories where workers wove, cut, and sewed the towels and sheets and shirts and pants made from that cotton drove much of the economy of the rural South. The union was eager to organize textile workers, many of whom were blacks and women, getting their first opportunity for real employment the year the Civil Rights Act became law. The union came to fight inequity in the workplaces of the Jim Crow South. My father saw the Southern labor movement as his opportunity to do what his father had done and fight injustice in the world.
And that's really when you spent the most time with your father, who was a very busy labor attorney, was when he would take you out into these rural areas and have the conversations. What was it he called the people?
Well, it's called the rank and file. The rank and file, which is a labor union term for the people who work, do the handwork, who are physically there, as opposed to the bosses. So I'm looking for that section here.
I believe it's in the same chapter.
It is in the same chapter.
Again, but
it's so funny when you write a book and you're like, where's that part about? Here we go, I've got it. Shall I do that?
Sure.
Dad took me with him on day trips in the summers and occasionally during the school year. Short trips that I knew without being told were honorary. We drove to country towns around Atlanta, Noonan and Covington and Cartersville. Outside of Atlanta, the roads devolved from possum gray asphalt to blood red clay. We talked about school, about the relative merits of the Beatles versus the Monkees, about not being frightened about Sarah's being sick. I was almost 8. Outside the car's open window, green kudzu vines splayed over lonely houses like witches' claws. This is one of the few times that my father attempted to broach the subject of our family, of medicine, of doctors, but I didn't want to talk about my sister Sarah. I wanted the private time of being the only daughter with my father, traveling through the world outside our home. When we got to our destination, we pulled off the road, bumped over ruts, and rolled to a stop, often in a field of beaten-down grass. Almost instantly, Dad was surrounded by ropey black men in overalls and serious women in print dresses. They talked with him under pecan trees or on the front steps of their homes, cooling their faces with the paper fans that came as giveaways from funeral parlors and appliance stores. Dad wore a suit and tie to meet the people he called the rank and file, a phrase he uttered with the solemnity other men used when they said amen at the end of a prayer. He bent his head and conversed with them in a deferential way. Between sips of sweet tea from metal cups or scrubbed-out jars, I said, "Thank you, ma'am, and pleased to meet you, sir," to elbows and knees that rushed off to get their time with my father. Sometimes they dragged their own staring children away from me, the only white child for miles, the only child in a Maud Culottes outfit patterned with sunflowers. My clothing looked perfect when I left Atlanta, but was awkward here, where groovy was meaningless. On our way home, I sang the song about the Union maid who never was afraid, shall we? Of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raid. In my imagination, I was the valiant Union maid, and nothing could keep me down. My father, steering a company car with his nicotine-stained index finger, loosened his tie and imagined himself Atticus Finch.
I don't know many people who have, at least for me, read To Kill a Mockingbird and not wanted Atticus to be their father at some point.
Yeah.
Who all went through a kind of an Atticus Finch
Dad phase.
Yes.
Yeah. And, my dad kind of looked like Gregory Peck. There's pictures of him in here, and people have made that comment. I think, Caitlin, you made that comment. And I made that connection here in this book because of the pioneering civil rights lawyer, justice, little girl sort of trope thing happening. Mm-hmm. But he did imagine himself Atticus Finch. I mean, we watched that movie. I remember watching it with him on the portable TV in the house. And I also remember there's a line where I think it's Atticus explains what To Kill a Mockingbird means. And I remember my sister Sarah walked in the room at that very moment and tripped over the cable. And the TV went, To Kill a Mockingbird means...
Oh!
So it came on again and we had to watch it again.
Right.
But, Sarah at that time was 4, so
Yeah.
she wasn't a great walker.
Yeah.
So,
But to be raised in a house where you have these very progressive parents with these big ideals, and you are spending your free time with your dad, going out with him as his job to help the rank and file in there, they kind of left you to fill in a lot of blanks.
Yeah.
All of these, you were experiencing all of these things, but they weren't exactly sitting you down and saying, well, this is...
Well, they did.
Yeah.
I mean, they did. It was sort of understood that justice is part of what a person does in the world, whoever that person is. In our case, we were a non-observant Jewish family, but it is our job to bring justice and fairness to the world around us. And I don't remember ever being told that in that explicit language, but I must have been told it because I synthesized it into this. And there's a phrase in Judaism called tikkun olam that translates roughly to repairing the world, or the repair of the world. And that's one of the few sort of Jewish things in our house, that and something called the Pirkei Avot. And the idea being that in this family, how do you bring justice to people around you when you can't necessarily make it happen in your own family? Which goes sort of to the larger story of Invisible Sisters. And the father that I write about here in this material, this is taking us up to April 1968, 50 years ago and 20 minutes ago. And that was a very, very terrible year in the United States for so many reasons. Having to do with Vietnam, having to do with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, having to do with the assassination of Dr. King, having to do with, the list goes on. And then you bring that into our house, and it was also a very, very breaking year in this family for personal reasons, which is also part of what I talk about in the book. So part of the conflict that I'm dealing with here is learning what you brought up, which is, was I ever told this lesson? How did I synthesize this lesson? And how do you bring this lesson of justice, bringing justice to the world around you? How do I bring it to bear every day now? And how do you? And how does everybody here? How do we do this even though we have got injustices perpetrated upon us, culturally, emotionally, socially, genetically, in my case?
Do you think maybe they were trying to explain why they were sometimes absent from your life?
No.
No?
No, because the absences had to do with taking care of my sisters.
Right.
Because I went with my dad on a lot of these kinds of missions, if you will. And if I didn't, I knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
So there's that. And I was very honored to go with him because it was interesting. Everybody here has a parent that they loved, mother or father. There was a special parent to you, and that private time with that parent, particularly when they treated you as an adult, or they gave you responsibility, or they let you understand, here's what it's like to be a grown-up, here's what the world is going to be like for you. You take that in. If you're a smart kid, you take that in. So those were very important times to me. And also my mother, was very willing to let me do that, because while my mother was not an activist outside of the home particularly, although she was a wonderful person and literate and worked and had great politics, her feeling was that it's my responsibility to go out with my father and see what I needed to see, and see what he could, at that point in his life, what he could show me.
And she was in agreement with him that you should go with him.
Oh, totally.
To the funeral.
Totally. She was the one in agreement with him, that I should go to the funeral, because Susie, if I was 8, Susie was 6, and Sarah was, what's 8 less 6? Is 2. Thank you. Mm-hmm. She was 2 or 3. Yeah, there's some things I can't do.
2 English degree, communication background.
Okay, yeah. So, a 5 or 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, this is not a thing that they can really do. Certainly not a public funeral. Mm-hmm. And my mother was entirely in agreement. And when I was writing this book, I went through I keep stuff. And I had calendars. I had my childhood calendars. And I went to that date in that year, and I saw that I had written in ballpoint pen that I had gone to the funeral. I don't think I kept a diary at that time. I didn't start keeping a diary for another year or 2. Because at 8, I really wasn't that much of a writing person. But my mother told me subsequently in writing, in my researching this book, that she absolutely was in agreement that Jack should take me. Mm-hmm. There was no pushback on that.
Right.
So, yeah.
So do you want to talk about what your dad was doing in terms of what his involvement was in 1968?
I don't really know exactly what he was doing. I mean, he was, in 68, he was still working for the union. Mm-hmm. He somehow got invited to Dr. King's funeral, and I've since learned from people that his being invited and his bringing me must have been the pulling of strings or the knowing of someone. And I know that he, I think he probably knew people who knew Dr. King. He may have met Dr. King. I think he had. They certainly weren't, close friends. But somehow my dad got invited, and he brought me. And so I will read that section.
Sure.
Okay. If I can find it.
Because I thought it was very perceptive of you. And you'll read from that section, but you thought that he had been in Memphis.
He was in Memphis.
So.
Yeah. And I have in my house, and you've seen it, in the back hallway, a poster that says Honor King and Racism. I have this poster, which is part of the I Am a Man series as well. And I remember very clearly my father giving it to me, waking me up at night, and giving it to me when he came back from Memphis. And it had been rolled up, probably in the overhead bin in a Piedmont Airlines regional jet. So it's not in the best shape. And then I had it in my dorm room, like with thumbtacks. So I need to have it restored, but it's in the hallway. And I've kept it. Because he brought it to me and bestowed it upon me. I remember him waking me up from a deep sleep to say, here is this thing I brought you. So, even though I was a child, my parents believed that I could absorb knowledge about the world beyond our home. I had already read newspaper headlines and eaten my dinner to the backdrop of the evening news. I had heard conversations about racism and rights in the workplace. I'm sure that because of this, I was allowed to watch the world change that spring. I saw my first dead body when I was 8 years old. In the early evening of April 4, 1968, I was sitting on the floor watching a Woody Woodpecker cartoon. When the newsbreak interrupted my show, I knew that if I didn't tell what I had heard right away, I would be in big trouble. In stocking feet, I hopped up and slid into the kitchen in a run. Mom was sweeping the floor. Hey, Mom, does Dad know somebody named Dr. Martin Luther King? I spoke all 7 syllables of his name jammed together, as if they were one word. She put the broom aside and gave me a quizzical look. Yes, she answered. I knew that some of Dad's friends had gone to Memphis earlier that week, intending to put their support or their good intentions behind the months-long sanitation workers' strike there. I think Dr. King got shot, I said. I felt as if I were waving my arms to capture my balance on the edge of the adult world. My mother reached for the phone. Dad took me to King's funeral the following Tuesday. Mom agreed with him that my going was part of my social legacy. It's the kind of language that I grew up with in my home, my social legacy. Susie and Sarah were too young to attend. Reading news clippings today gives me perspective on the event my father allowed me to see. That day he was quiet and spoke almost in a whisper, even before we entered the church. His step wasn't heavy for a tall man, but he usually moved hard, sitting with enough force that couch cushions tumbled to the floor or grinding his car's gears when he drove. But that day my father moved gently. We were two people of more than 100,000 to fill Auburn Avenue, a busy street that extended from the historically black business district west into downtown. All were on foot, and some held black umbrellas open to shade themselves from the sun. Mourners crossed the threshold of Ebenezer Baptist Church alone or in twos and threes. Inside, the sunlight and the electric light mixed together, making a yellow glow. News cameras whirred in the springtime heat. When we reached the casket after what seemed like an hour or more, my father lifted me high above the lip of the casket so that I could pay my respects to Dr. King. For a moment, I was mesmerized. I could see now that he had not been tall. I had watched him on television speaking to crowds, shining with sweat. His face was round, and here, close enough to touch, his skin was oddly dusted and dry. After just a minute, suspended over the coffin, I wanted urgently to be set down. The elastic waistband of my dress pinched my skin, and my father's thumbs dug into my armpits, pushed there by his awkward support of my weight. My father put me down, and we walked forward with the slow crowd, moving out of the church door, past the green wooden farm wagon and the harnessed mules, waiting to take Dr. King's body away.
Did anybody else see the Rosalind Bentley story on the AJC today? The pictures of the service and everything?
Yeah. I always look in those crowds.
Amazing to see just people everywhere. And they were, this was a gentleman who's now 70 years old. He's a 20-year-old college student who just grabbed his camera and came down from Reinhardt College to take pictures because he knew it was going to be, he could only afford one roll of film. And so I thought about, I always think of you when I think of that funeral procession.
What a legacy that is that my dad gave me, that now people think, people who know me think that. In writing this book, as an 8-year-old, you don't know that there's 100,000 people there. You don't know the history or the direction necessarily of Auburn Avenue. So in writing this book, I had my memories. I had this vision in my head, and I had the calendar that said that I did it. And I know I did it. So I did a fair amount of research. And one of the things, you and I were talking about this, one of the things that really tripped me up is, as a Jew, Jews don't have open casket funerals. In Judaism, it's considered inappropriate to do that and to look at the body. And so in thinking that it was an open casket funeral, I was thinking, that can't be right. That's not a thing. But I was like, of course it is. So I looked at pictures. I did historical searches. I looked at Time Magazine. I talked to various people. I talked to Rebecca Burns. I talked to all kinds of people. And then I saw a picture in a news archive, and I was like, that's what I saw. So this verifies what's happening in here. Yes, of course, this is what I saw. And in terms of the temperature that day and how many people were there, that comes from news reports of the era, from news coverage with the estimated crowd. And you can see the green wagon at the King Center, at the King Center, right?
Yeah.
So there was a fair amount of research that went into me as an adult revisiting what I remembered and trying to get comfortable with, am I telling the truth? Are my memories right? So, yeah.
Do you want to talk about the process that you went through and trying to, you already confessed to us that you do keep a lot of things, which is a great thing because, when you buy and read the book, at the beginning of every chapter, there's an epigraph and it's a snippet from, a journal entry
or medical records,
or a letter that your mom wrote talking about your sister
singing different variations of the Oscar Mayer.
Susie, yeah.
So,
It takes you right back to the 60s.
when did you start sorting through all of that information and begin writing this?
Wow. I think, well, the basic story here is that I'm the oldest of three sisters, and by the time I was 32, I was the only one living. So my sister Susie, who was the middle sister, was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 6, and she died when she was 8. And I always tell people, I really want to stress that a diagnosis of acute lymphocytic leukemia is very different now than it was when she was diagnosed in 1966. What happened simultaneously was that our little sister Sarah was born with a very rare genetic illness called Castleman syndrome, that unless you are a pediatric geneticist, I don't expect you to know what it is. I've had pediatric geneticists in an audience, and every once in a while I'll see somebody in the audience go, it's like, okay, I've done my research. But what that is it's the inability to produce enough white cells of a particular kind of white cell to fight off infection. So it's very, very rare, and it's fatal. It's also, these two illnesses had never been seen in one family, in one generation, at the same time, ever. So we were sort of what my mother called a reverse miracle. So Susie died when she was 8 and I was 10, and Sarah died when she was 27 and I was 32. And I want to be very clear that this wasn't a movie of the week kind of thing where people are gasping on a gurney and, having injections and things like that. We lived very, very normal lives, except when we didn't. So much of that credit goes to my mother for, maintaining this ship of state. So in terms of keeping things, in writing this book, one of the things that I've wrestled with my whole life, starting here, is how do you not only bring justice to others, but to yourself and to the people you love? And what happens if you can't? And how do you tell that story? And I keep journals. I have in my house, I have a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, pretty much, and in it are all the journals I've kept since I was about 9. Starting with, the little one with the kissing puppies that we all had, girls all had it in whenever, with the lock that you can basically pop with your thumb. Like, who thought that would matter? It's like, oh, it's locked. No, it's not. And I went back into those and I revisited like my parents when they were young and me when I was young. And it really went all the way through present day. Mm-hmm. I also wrote away to hospitals, to half a dozen hospitals: Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, Eggleston, Boston Children's, some others for my sister's medical records, which I was able to get. My mother signed off on them, and you can do that. And I went through stacks of medical records to kind of figure out who am I, who were they, who are the parents, what was happening in the world. So I also made a timeline, or a 3-part timeline. One timeline was me. I was born, I did this, I did the other thing, I went to camp, I went to college, I dated this person, I did this, I did that. And then I made a simultaneous or parallel timeline about my sisters, right? Their births, their illnesses, their deaths, this surgery, this time this thing happened. And then I made a third timeline, which was what was happening in Atlanta and the South at that time. What was the world in which this family lived? Particularly because this family was, and it's an interesting thing to refer to your own family as this family, because then I'm looking at it as characters in a story, as opposed to my mother, my father, my sister, me. So what was happening in the Atlanta that these people inhabited, right? We've got certainly this, we've got the civil rights movement, we've got my father's involvement with this, we've got what we were taught, we've got the death of Dr. King, we move into some political stuff, we've got some things in here about, anybody here remember the strip? 8th and Juniper? Hi, Jim. Yeah, we got, there's stuff in there about that. So I needed to place this in this world, and I'm looking now at a memoirist across from me talking about, yes, it is your story, but unless you spend your whole life in the basement, you also live in a world with other people, with cultural issues, with politics, with music, with fashion, with anxieties, with love. How does all that come together in the story? How does that commune? So yeah, the journals got heavy read-through, and I went after them with highlighters and Post-it notes.
Yeah. I think the other thing that you and I have talked about is how we are with our families is different from how we are with the rest of the world.
Code switching.
And so being a part of that family and discovering, that you have gone through the ringer of having two sisters who are sick, and that you had to, at one point you were introduced yourself as I'm the well sibling.
Oh, the well sibling, yeah. Probably 1969, Duke University, we did some studies up there because doctors wanted to know, how did this happen? So did we. And I introduced myself to a doctor as, hi, I'm the well sibling. I was 9 or 10 years old. And I must have heard that from an adult, oh, she's the well sibling. Right. I can't imagine that I would have generated that myself. I was a pretty sophisticated kid, but that's a little much. So yeah, I introduced myself as the well sibling. But not in a pejorative way. I didn't look at my sisters in a way that they were lesser. It was sort of like saying, oh, I'm the sibling with curly hair. I mean, it was just sort of like how I identified myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were the eldest sister. But as you said, it wasn't all sad story. I mean, this book is, a lot of love letters to Sarah and Susie, too, and to your mom.
Yeah.
About how she really, through everything that, your parents went through and trying to care for 3 daughters, she really was had a great gusto for life and wanted everybody to live life.
Yeah, my mother was great, and my mother's motto really was living well is the best revenge. And by that she didn't mean money. She meant, enjoy, seize the day, carpe diem, Living well is the best revenge. Enjoy yourself. And it's also, this book is also in a weird way a love letter to my dad, because the section that I read, the 2 pieces that I read, this was my father at his best. 1968 pretty much destroyed him in terms of what he believed could be accomplished, and partly because of seeing what happened to Dr. King, but also, and I have a photograph here, also because that was the year that Susie was diagnosed and that Sarah was known to be fatally ill. So this is a father of 3 kids. This is 30 years old, maybe 32 years old, young guy, with big dreams. The world, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to fix everything. And then the things you believe in, your political heroes, your cultural heroes, are murdered. And you come home and your kids are dying. He had nowhere to turn emotionally. Mm-hmm. So this was really kind of a hard year for him as well. And for my mom, being the mother in this family. But yeah, my mother was wonderful. And there is a lot of really fun stuff in here. And in writing this, with a memoir, you look at photographs, or you look at that concert ticket stub, or you look at that weird postcard, particularly photographs, and you look at a photograph and you go, oh, you did not have that haircut, right? Or, you really dated that person? Oh, God, remember?
There are pictures in here, too, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
Which I always think is very satisfying when I read a memoir or biography. I love them. Sometimes they always cram them in the middle, and I'm always
we
did
the
middle section. But
yeah, I love this one at the beginning of part 2 because the look on my face, and that's a Paideia t-shirt. The look on my face is like, who are these people? What is happening? So it's 1975, so I'm 14 or 15. It's a great picture. There's some fun stuff in here.
Let's talk about your Paideia experience and one of your teachers at Paideia.
Oh, Pat.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Pat. Pat. I was at Paideia in the early years of the Paideia school.
Yeah.
And my father actually pushed back on that because he felt that I should stay in public school with, again, the rank and file. But public high school in Atlanta in the early 70s was not the educational experience that my mother wanted me to have. And she went to bat, and I went to Paideia. Which was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And one of my first writing teachers other than the fact that my parents were extremely literate, and my mother diagrammed sentences on the kitchen table.
I was going to say, she was kind of the big grammar.
She was the grammar hammer, yeah. Well, we had a Formica kitchen table that, here's a trick about Formica, you can draw on it with a pencil and then wipe it out with your thumb. So I learned to diagram sentences on our kitchen table. Pat Conroy taught briefly at Paideia in, I guess, 75 or 76, because Santini was in Galleys, and Santini came out in 76, so it must have been 75 or 76. And he taught a group of kids, taught writing, and he was fabulous. He changed my life. I don't even remember the writing assignments. I remember something about pulling a clipping out of a newspaper and sort of elaborating on what that story would be. But I got so much encouragement from him, and also sort of some ideas about how to focus, which I could still use. But one of the things that he did was he was the first professional writer I ever met, although my mother had been a magazine editor when I was very little and then went back to it much later than that. But he talked to us about writing a book and about editing a book and about working with an editor and about getting your proofs back and about all this stuff. And I remember being absolutely enthralled because I want to be this. And Pat was a very big personality, too, so that was also captivating.
I know you have a paper that you showed me once that had his comments on it. It was just very specific comments.
I think I still have it on my phone. I think I might have to dig it up.
Yeah. But...
in fountain pen. I realized looking at it recently, I was like, he wrote that with a fountain pen.
So, do you want to talk more about, like, moving out and going into the world, into college, and then becoming a big shot TV producer out in
I wasn't a big shot TV producer.
Sure you got to put up with some of the stars.
Yes, I have had scrambled eggs thrown at me. I went out to Los Angeles. My undergraduate degree is in communications from Emerson College in Boston. And I went out to Los Angeles kind of before I knew anybody out there. I sort of tell the joke that I was 35,000 feet over Nebraska before I realized I didn't know anybody, which is not entirely true. My father was living out there. And so I think I slept under the piano in his house for a little while until I had to go get an apartment. I worked as a production assistant, production coordinator for terrible television shows. Name That Tune. Great old jazz guys, though. I'll tell you what, you go to tape at 4 o'clock, and the AFM guys are also the Carson guys, because they went to tape at like 5:30 or 6. And they were fabulous old jazz guys. Really, really amazing. And then I was a production coordinator, production manager on a lot of television shows out there for about 6 years, and loved it. And I was in Los Angeles in the 80s. Yeah. But I missed my mother and I missed my sister. Sarah was alive at that point. My father had moved to Singapore, where he was working in refugee relocation. So you can see the attempt to continue to assist people, sometimes to the detriment of assisting your own family. And I missed them, and so I came back east. Right about the time Sarah got her driver's license, so we would go driving around. She was a terrible driver, and it was a lot of fun. When you have a 16-year-old sister who's just gotten her driver's license and has like a vendetta, it's just like, hold on to your hats, people.
In Atlanta.
No, this was this was Harrisburg, PA. They were back in Harrisburg at that point.
At that point, they were back.
Yeah.
And you continued in your TV career until when?
I was in Boston, and then I was here at a large cable network that occupies several locations in this city that we all know and many of us have worked for. And I was there until 98, 99, and then worked in post-production, and then got out of it, and decided to go to graduate school because I'd always wanted to write. And my mother said, go to graduate school. And I wrote Invisible Sisters in grad school. So it took me from being 7, 8, 9 years old and looking around and going, what sense do I make of this family? What sense do I make of this story? You know, one of the questions that we all ask each other and that is always asked of us is, do you have any brothers or sisters? It's a common question. And in my case, I realized as a young adult and a less young adult that I didn't know how to answer that. Because if I say no, I am lying about people I love, including myself. And if I say yes and they are dead, I have just dumped a pile of mess on you that you didn't ask for. So where is the place where I go, right? And when I wrote Invisible Sisters, my mother was living and my father had died at that point, but his death is not in the book. So I wrote the book in graduate school because I really wanted to figure out, in terms of writing a memoir, how do I answer this crucial question about myself and about the people I love and about the city I love and the world in which I grew up? Because as time marches on, here we are 50 years and an hour now, 50 years past, people forget. You know, people forget our families. People forget that time when you did that thing. But more importantly, on a cultural level, they forget this political event or this hero or this meaning or what mattered to people in 1960, 70, 80. Part of what writing this book is about is to say, this happened, I was there, let me tell you what it mattered to me and what it can matter to you. You know, my story with my family is my story. It's not your family. But everybody has got some kind of thing that happened that they need to figure out. And it happened in a world where other things were happening. It took place in a historical situation. So how do you place yourself in that? So that was the impulse.
One thing that you've always taught me, too, when you're writing memoir or something that is so personal, that is part of you, that you have to be able to achieve some distance. Either time has to have passed, or you have to have removed yourself from that space, or the distance that you were talking about and just saying, I'm researching this family, not my family.
Yeah, there's an element of distance in that, even though you know it's your family. And when you look at a picture, you know, you look at a photograph of your family, or that time when we all did that thing. And outside the parameters of the photograph, you know what's happening in the other room. You know stuff that another person won't see in that picture. So it's this weird place of like, what's in the picture and what else do I know? Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and Mary Karr in The Art of Memoir has like a checklist. Like, are you ready to write this memoir? And one of them is, has enough time passed for you to?
Yeah, and I can't tell you when enough time is.
Yeah.
You know, you will know. You will know. And there's places that I can't go. I mean, I have a box in my office, a hat box, because my mother liked hat boxes. And in that hat box, along with slides and Kodak slides with that little orange, you know, slides and birthday cards and all this stuff, is a 1/4-inch reel-to-reel tape. Now, I can get my hands on 1/4-inch playback, or I can just have it transferred to MP4. I have the technology. But what it says is 3 girls playing. It is Jessica, Susie, and Sarah, and it must be 1965 because Sarah was just born. Can I listen to that? There is no way I can listen to that. I know that I cannot hear that. I will not, at this point, survive it. But that being said, I also don't want to throw it away. Because maybe in 10 years I'll be able to listen to it. And I don't want anybody else to have it. But I just want to know that it's in that hat box on the shelf, up there, on the right. I know where it is. I know I can't listen to it, but I know that I want to keep it. So there's a place that you can write about with that as well.
When did you start being not just a student of writing, but also a teacher? Because you are a very gifted teacher.
Thank you.
So weirdly, we visited our class yesterday.
Yeah, they loved you. Yeah, I'm going to hear all about it tomorrow, too. And weirdly, it was my father's idea.
Yeah.
I think I'd gotten out of grad school and was between jobs, and he said, oh, you should go teach like adult ed or something. And I was like, yeah, Dad, whatever, okay, sure, whatever. And then I went for an interview somewhere, and I got the job, and the day I got the job was it the day my father died, or it was like that week? Or maybe it was at his you know, when I was up at his house up in Massachusetts. But it was this really weird convergence. Because, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah, that's what writers do. We teach.
We teach.
We teach.
Because since you've written your memoir, you've published another book called Braving the Fire, which is what did we say it was? It was like the only guide to grief.
It's called Braving the Fire, a guide to writing about grief and loss. And, I sort of regret the deck on that, because a lot of times people feel that it's only writing about death and dying, which of course the heavy hitters for grief and loss, you say grief and loss, and people go right away for death and dying. But anything that changes your story, anything that you say, I was going to be this, and then something happened and I'm that. Did you lose a job? Did you have a difficult coming out experience? Did you have a difficult divorce? Did you move from a place you loved? Did you this? Did you that? But that's not a really good deck. Braving the Fire, did you this, did you that? So, that doesn't really work. So it is a guide to how to write well about difficult subjects. And I interviewed a lot of memoirists who I adore. Abigail Thomas, Nick Flynn, Lee Martin.
Janice Ray.
Janice Ray, absolutely. Janice was so generous with this. And
you organized it around
the stages of grief, which came out, the Kubler-Ross book came out in 1969, so it came out a little late for us with Susie. And Kubler-Ross later in her life kind of stepped back from the stages of grief as being the only way. But I treated them as kind of scaffolding. We all know them, or we've all heard of them, even if we can't recite them, we know what they are. So the idea of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and then I made a new one called renewal. And how do you attach your writing to this? What are you denying? Are you denying your right to tell your story? What are you angry about? Are you angry at that doctor who gave that poor diagnosis or had that bad bedside manner? Are you angry at your mom? Are you angry at your dad? What are you angry at? How do you make that into a viable story? Bargaining, shape of the memoir. Is it a hybrid? Is it a direct narrative? Does it have pictures? How are you going to shape it? And so on and so forth.
And there's a story in Braving the Fire about finding a certain picture
weird.
that I thought would connect us back to the original story of you attending the funeral and learning more about your father.
And I also brought a reprint of the picture with me. I have a actual photograph, but I brought this instead. About a year after my father died, my husband and I took a trip to Memphis, Tennessee. We wanted to see Graceland for the kitsch and a nostalgic thrill for the pioneering younger Elvis, who was long gone by the time we picked up the rock and roll habit. As our vacation weekend came to a close, we found ourselves at a diner near the National Civil Rights Museum, which is housed in what had been the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. My husband wanted to go to the museum. I hesitated, not because I lacked admiration for what the museum represented, but because I was positive that there couldn't be anything there that I hadn't learned at my father's knee and sometimes witnessed firsthand. But I knew that I would be unhappy with myself if I left Memphis without paying my respects. We finished our breakfast and crossed the street to the low-slung 1950s brick building. I remember now that the museum was excellent, but what's indelible in my memory is a photograph I came face to face with at the end of an exhibit leading to the exit. The photograph was a black and white shot of my father, sitting on a curb in Memphis 4 days after Dr. King was killed. My father is holding a white placard reading Honor King and Racism. Beside him is another man holding a placard reading Union Justice Now. Both men wear dark suits and skinny ties. They look exhausted. They are also heartbroken. Their expressions as they look directly into the camera are unmistakable. My father, a white man, his friend black, a man I recall from my childhood but whose name I can't remember no matter how hard I try. The caption on the picture did not name them. It only called the two men unidentified. To the photographer, these were just two people, emblematic of many in a terrible time. But to me, this was no unidentified man. This was my father. I processed all of this information in seconds. Someone watching would have seen a woman approaching a photograph, stopping in her tracks, gasping once and bursting into tears. My father had died less than a year earlier, and here was his face on a museum wall. He hadn't known about the photo, I was sure. He would have been proud of it. He would have told me about it, and certainly more than once. In the picture, my father was young, the very beginning of the losses that would shape his life, appearing in the way he sprawled on the curb and in the lost look in his eyes. Susie and Sarah were both newly sick then. Susie not yet 6, Sarah a toddler. His life was changing quickly, and on that day, a stranger had frozen my father in time. His 2 youngest daughters were dying, and his hero had been murdered. In that picture, I saw what might have been the very moment of my father's change from idealist to cynic. I felt an ironic and accidental personal injustice in a site dedicated to justice. One person who could identify him best, me, had nearly chosen not to come to the museum. Shaken, I asked a guard to take me to an administrator. He did, and I explained to her what had just happened and how important it was that the names of those people in the pictures be known. She gave me the contact information for the photographer whose work was being showcased in that exhibit, a man named Benedict Fernandez. The photos were from his book called Countdown to Eternity. I corresponded with him and felt a circle closing. I wish that I could also remember my father's friend's name if I ever knew it to begin with. I hope that someone in his family has seen the photograph, or that he has if he's still living. A visitor to that exhibit or a reader perusing the photo book it was based on sees a documentary photo of 2 weary men on a day that changed countless people. I see my father and a haze of sorrow that surrounded him. I can hear the lyrics to the protest songs that I learned along with my counting songs and alphabet songs. I smell his cigarettes, the 4 packs of Pall Mall unfiltered that he smoked every day for years. I cringe from the terse bark of his angry voice and the elegant rolling pace when he recited poetry. I see a photograph and I get a story that only I can write. I want to know who this other man is, and I haven't been able to find anybody who can identify him. And I do remember him, because you know how when you're a kid and your parents have people over and there's Dad's friend, Mr. Jones or whatever, and I just don't remember the guy's name. I mean, it's been 50 years since I've seen it. So I am going to have it open, and if anybody happens to say, oh, I know that guy or I know that guy's kids, I would love to hear that.
I'm going to post a link to the photo that Jessica referenced on our website at literaryatlanta.com. And if you have any information about the man's identity, you can email us at literaryatlanta@gmail.com. Great news if you're a fan of Jessica Handler. She has a new book coming out in 2019 from Hub City Press. Be on the lookout for her first work of fiction, The Magnetic Girl. In the meantime, we have other new books to celebrate. Tonight, May 1st, marks the launch of suspense and mystery writer Emily Carpenter's latest book, Every Single Secret. Her book launch party takes place from 6 to 8 p.m. at Mac McGee in Roswell. Social justice activist Janet Dewart Bell visits the Atlanta History Center on Wednesday, May 2nd, to talk about her book, Lighting the Fires of Freedom, African American Women in the Civil Rights Movement. The book's publication coincides with the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Bell's event begins at 7 p.m. Admission for all lectures is $10 for the general public, $5 for members, and free for AHC insiders. That same evening at 7 o'clock, the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library welcomes C. Donald Johnson. Johnson, a former U.S. trade representative, has written The Wealth of a Nation, an authoritative history of the politics of trade in America from the founding to the Trump era. On Thursday, May 3rd, President Carter's top domestic policy advisor, Stuart Eizenstat, comes to the Carter Center. He'll be discussing and signing copies of President Carter, The White House Years. The publisher sent me a copy of this book. It is quite substantial, almost 1,000 pages, including a foreword by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and full-color photos in the middle section. This Friday and Saturday, Foxtail Bookshop welcomes back singer-songwriter and now short story writer Radney Foster to Woodstock. Foster will perform from his new CD and its corresponding short story collection, For You to See the Stars, on Friday night. And on Saturday afternoon at 3, Foster joins other authors, musicians, and artists involved in the Traveling Trio exhibit. It all starts with a book. Remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website at literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you like to get your podcasts. That may be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.